Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
My guest today is a well-known singer who you will remember from the 1960s music scene. My guest is known for performing a mix of R&B, rock and pop ballads. He is also known for his onstage persona, where he would hide behind a prop or an item of clothing and would act as if his microphone lead was a snake. My guest has had several UK hits. He covered Chuck Berry's classic, Memphis, Tennessee, The Strange Effect, written by Kink's frontman, Ray Davies, Little Things, a cover version of Bobby Goldboro's Stateside hit, and I'm Going to Take You There, penned by Tennessee talent, Graham Gouldman. My guest's most famous hit is the 1964 classic, The Crying Game, which reached number 5 in the UK singles chart. The song was used in the acclaimed 1992 thriller of the same name, directed by Neil Jordan. The song has also been covered by actress Kate Robbins and Culture Club's Boy George. My guest has worked with a who's who of great session musicians: Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, Big Jim Sullivan, and Bobby Graham. He has toured the globe and shared the stage with several high-profile bands and artists: James Brown, The Animals, The Small Faces, Adam and the Ants, The Sex Pistols, The Troggs, The Searchers, The Human League, Van Morrison, and many more. Today I'm joined by Dave Berry. We look back at Dave's upbringing, his education, and his mentors. We reminisce about the 1960s music scene, its cultural impact and the hits, life on the road and the many tours, and still performing at the ripe old age of 81. A very warm welcome, Dave.
Good to be here. Yeah.
Thank you kindly for joining me on this evening for your take. From the introduction alone, there's much to cover in regard to your musical endeavors and all the things you've done and seen. But can we go back to the very beginning? You were born David Holgate Grundy on February the 6th, 1941 in Woodhouse, Sheffield. What are your memories of childhood? And can you describe what life was like growing up in Sheffield during the post-war period?
Yes, well, I had a very sort of sparse, strange upbringing, really. My school days, in my memory, are sort of virtually non-existent, really. I can't really remember much about my formative years. So I was never an academic or did very well at school. I mean, I left school when I was 15, and in the days of sort of guidance to careers, we didn't have a career officer coming round to recommend paths to take. So I started out working. My dad got me a job in one of the local factories, works, which I trained as an electric welder. But my family life at home, especially when I became a young person, sort of 15, my dad, fortunately, was in the music business, only semi-professionally, as a dance band drummer, and also played in a brass band in the village where I grew up. So I did have, it's like many people when they're growing up, you don't realize the influences of your parents until you're sort of older. You look back on it and think, oh, that's where that came from. So my first instrument was playing my dad's drums. And so it was 2 sections, my career. Before I was 15, I'm very vacant about it all. And then as soon as I was 15, when rock and roll started, I seemed to develop a sort of path in life. And that's how my career started.
Dave, your father's name has cropped up already, and you've spoken about in later years reminiscing about your family life, particularly about your parents. We'll come on to them. Can you just give us an insight on your parents, and do you have any siblings? And can you just tell us a bit about their background, what they did for a living, and were you particularly close to them?
Yeah, well, taking your last part of the question, I was very close to my parents. They were very, very helpful to me when I started my career. But as I say, my dad was a semi-professional dance band drummer, so I had those influences in the early days. But his regular job was a bricklayer property repairer. And my mum worked as a dinner lady at my local school. So it was a very sort of ordinary working class background. We lived in a rented property and didn't have sort of much of, it was the days before, European and foreign holidays. We just went to our particular area, which, as the south of England has sort of Brighton and Clacton, our areas for holidays were sort of Bridlington, Scarborough on the East Yorkshire coast. So that was nice. But there was a very, very big influence on me in the early days. My dad gave me a lot of good advice in the early days when we first started the band, just starting out. Advice sounds very sort of ordinary now, but things like when you buy the band's van, don't buy it communally between the band, or you finish up having arguments all the time. Like, you had the van on Tuesday and I want it on Tuesday next week. So things like that. And then the biggest piece of advice he gave me was don't play at working men's clubs, which was a really, really good advice, because he pointed out at that time that we were playing in the early days, Eddie Cochran, Chuck Berry, John Lee Hooker, Muddy Waters. If you play working men's clubs, you're going to have to play the current pop songs at that time, which were sort of Cliff Richard, Marty Wilde, Adam Faith, which in later years they became my colleagues and friends. But at that time they were really just variety artists, and it wasn't in the line of my work at that particular time. So that was very, very good advice from my parents. And when we became successful, it was a general meeting place for the musicians and road managers with my mum and dad's house. They were very, very friendly and came on the gigs with us, and it was a really good start for my career.
You've already spoken about your father's musical background, but can you tell me what music was being played in the family household, and what music inspired you, and where were you hearing that music and getting it from?
Well, first of all, in the house, it would be the American jazz bands and a British dance band, really. Ted Heath Band, Ken McIntosh Band, the Squadronaires, which is a strange connection there with Pete Townsend from The Who. His father was in the dance band, the Squadronaires. So his influences was sort of the early dance band music from America. And so I was hearing that at home. And at night, when I was sort of in my bed, I'd hear the musicians come back and they'd be chatting in the front room at home about music or where the gig had been that night. So that was my first influences. And also playing my dad's drums, much to the annoyance of our neighbours, because it is said that the worst instrument to play really when you're trying your career out is to be a drummer, battering, and the neighbours were complaining all the time. So I had a very, very happy time from being about 15. When I left school, it's as though rock and roll rescued me. I found, suddenly listening, Tom Jones said this. I'm going to do a lot of name dropping in this interview, by the way. I think Tom Jones said that his upbringing in Wales was exactly the same. Many of the artists that came through in the 60s had the same upbringing. We first listened to Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and they were not played on regular radio. We used to you'd hear them on jukeboxes, fairgrounds, cafes where the jukeboxes, that was the source that we as working class people were growing up in, listening to the music, but not on the radio. There was nothing on the radio apart from Radio Luxembourg, which I used to listen to, but that was a very limited. And when I was working, I remember, getting up at sort of 5:15 in the morning to listen to the American Forces Network out of Germany, which were playing stuff by Smiley Lewis and John Lee Hooker, all the early blues guys. Eddie Cochran, who came a little later, and Gene Vincent, all the rock and roll people. So a very exciting time to be growing up.
Exciting time growing up, and I've heard many people of your generation say that when they first heard rock and roll, it was like going from black and white to Technicolor. But what was it specifically about the music that kind of inspired you and kind of drove you to wanting to pursue a career in a band or as a performer?
Well, there was two sections really. I used to go to Sheffield City Hall and I'd see the dance bands, as we talked about a little earlier on, and they had most of these bands had three singers. I always remember vividly that Ted Heath Band had Dennis Lotis, Dickie Valentine, Lita Rosa, dance band singers, and they were the front people. And as the years went on, I did work with these people during the 60s because they were still young people in the 30s. And I remember I must have been attracted to more to the singers, I think, than the band itself. But even though my love of jazz is still with me now, I mean, my favorite stuff is, if I'm playing music at home, it's not anything from the 60s generally. It's stuff by, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and those sort of people. So that stood me in good stead to have a wide interest in all sorts of music, which is reflected in my set even today, all different songs.
We've spoken about your family life, your background, your parents who you were close to, and your musical influences. I wanted to come on to why you wanted to be a singer and a frontman. And was there anyone you particularly modeled yourself on? And can you also discuss your early musical experiences on the live scene and how you managed to get a break as a solo artist?
Okay. I think my first visual, you have to remember, unless you grew up in that late 50s, all the American singers had individual acts. Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, John Lee Hooker, Bo Diddley, Muddy Waters. They were all very sort of visual in their own way. And I was attracted to the visual performance. That's, I think, basically attracted me. And apart from the fact, as a young person, we didn't need any training at all to get into the music business. I mean, basic rock and roll is based on 3 chords anyway. It's not brain surgery. And that's why it attracted so many people like myself who had no vision at all of career or things like that. Our lives were not planned like from, in an academic, looking, you study well at school, then you get to college, university. We were just working class people who didn't have any plans at all. So really rock and roll rescued me from that. And then I went on to just remind me again of the second part of the question.
I basically was asking about your early musical experiences, particularly on the live scene.
Oh yeah,
and how you managed to get that break as a solo artist.
Yeah, well, we formed a little band. I mean, I sat in with a couple of bands locally. One very famous guy locally, who Richard Hawley went on to work with, strangely enough. Even Richard's many, many years younger than the 60s artist, but he worked with a guy called Chuck Fowler, who was a local, Chuck Fowler's Frantic Five, who were sort of an R&B based band, Chuck Berry and all the names I mentioned to you. I used to go in and sit in with him at local sort of back rooms of pubs and things. I'd get up and sing 2 or 3 Chuck Berry songs, and I just had a natural feel for it. I don't know. There was no plan. It's just I could sing in a fashion, and so that started. And then we formed the band, and in the early 60s, the people who were around at that time was Peter Stringfellow, who many people would know, but only from the clubs, the London club. But Peter was a huge promoter in Sheffield. He'd bring over all the names, all the American names would be playing at the Mojo Club. And he had about 3 or 4 clubs in Sheffield just for young people. And he booked all the bands in there. And so we were all growing up together. And the Esquire Club and the Club 60 in Sheffield, the Esquire then became the Lead Mill, which is still operating now. But the early days of the Lead Mill, the Esquire, they had, Rod Stewart, Elton John played there when they were in their formative years, like I was. And they were huge venues. Seem to have been forgotten in Sheffield, actually. Everyone mentions the Lead Mill and Pulp and all the bands. But nobody mentions that just prior to the Lead Mill, that place had, big Sonny Boy Williamson on, Screaming Jay Hawkins, Muddy, I don't know whether Muddy Waters played it, but Carl Perkins, and all these great names. I saw them all there and played on the same stages, but we were starting out. So we were there as fans, really watching them. We'd be on the stage and then we'd watch these guys who were our heroes. And then I went on to I saw Buddy Holly on his one and only tour, 58, I think it was. And to be absolutely honest, with Buddy Holly, I was a little disappointed, really, because they came in and they got sort of black evening suits on and white shirts and dicky bows. And I thought, well, that's not Little Richard, really, is it? So it was rather disappointing, that. But I heard all the great songs. And that's how we started out. Then we gradually built up a following. And then I came through after the Beatles. Many people think I was around before the Beatles. So when the Beatles broke in late 62, it was nearly a year afterwards that I got my record deal. And at that time, the record companies were searching the country for, up and coming talent who were making waves in their own areas, Newcastle, Birmingham. They were looking around. And I remember distinctly Mickey Most and Mike Smith, who then became my record producer at Decca. They came to Doncaster, of all places, and saw me on the show there with the Barron Knights, Freddie and the Dreamers, people like that. And I was signed up there. So, but during that interim period from when we first turned professional in about 1960, 61, we built up a huge following. We were working 5-6 nights each week at our own gigs. We were promoting our own gigs in sort of function rooms in hotels and things like that, and bringing in our own crowd. We followed my dad's advice, and so we would bring in our young people in who wanted to listen to Chuck Berry and all the early people, and we were playing all that stuff.
You've mentioned some incredible names so far, people who are trailblazers of roots music and, of course, rock and roll. But I want to pick up on you saying about rock and roll as your salvation, and you're intrigued with the front man and being a singer. And I wanted to ask you specifically about your onstage persona and what made you use props and clothing to hide behind. Was that intentional? And did you want to create a mystique as a live performer? And can I also ask you about using the microphone as a prop, a serpent or a snake? And where did that concept come from?
I started off, I picked up on Gene Vincent. So many of you younger viewers would not be really aware of this guy, but he had a very unusual act. He wore black leather, and he started with the microphone on the stand with it extended, and he did this sort of act. And then my act graduated from that. I took the mic stand off, the mic off the mic stand. And then I worked in Hamburg in Germany, and I was fascinated by strippers. We were working a lot with strippers. They don't exist anymore, do they, strippers? But they had these surreal, they tease the audience. They sort of, strip off thing. The best stripper I ever saw was in Hamburg, and she walked on stage with no clothes on and put them on. Very slow. She reversed the stripping, and she
wow,
everything on really slowly, and I loved that. And I worked in, when I came back from Hamburg, I worked in Blackpool at a rock venue there called the Picador Club. And the acrobats and the circus people used to come down to see us at, sort of 11 o'clock at night when their show had finished. And obviously I was invited to see their shows. And I was fascinated by the acrobats. And I remember doing a show in Scheveningen in Holland. And they had this huge scaffolding. And so I did the whole number climbing up this scaffolding. And I got all that from acrobats, trapeze artists, strippers. And it was this visual all the time, this visual thing creating images, but I don't basically know where it came from. To be absolute, I could have made up a story, but I don't really know. It was all these bits and pieces. And the anticipation, it is said that a show, I like the idea of a show where you hear the voice disconnected. You hear the voice, and I do it in my shows now. I don't appear straight away. So the band strike up and I'll do like 2 or 3 verses off the stage. And then I'll just come round the curtain. So it's teasing and theatrical and meant to be that, just openly, images, hands. I did read somewhere once, because I was always an avid reader of performance, and someone said that the most important thing of a stage performance is the impact you make first 2 or 3 minutes, right? And you've obviously got to fill in the rest of the hour, but then, and what they last see of you. So I used to have this, and still do sometimes, I'll come on with a sort of a white glove, right? So I've got the white glove that appears from behind the curtain and then disappears, and then I come onto the stage and I put the white glove in my pocket, right? And I've forgotten the glove for an hour. And then when I leave the stage at the end, as I'm walking off with my hand, I put my hand back in my pocket and pull out the black glove. So I put the black glove on slowly. So the last thing they see as I'm walking off the stage is the black glove disappearing behind the curtain. And it's visual. So at that thing, you've got the white glove and then you forget about it. And then at the end of the show, when they see me put my hand in my pocket, they think I'm going to come out with the white glove. I don't, I've got 2 gloves. Come out with the black glove. And I just love it. It entertains me, which is the most important thing. I love, I come off and I'll do something. I'll talk to road crews and things. I find that they'd come round to me, road crews, because they liked what I did, because it was visual. And they said, we found this old theatre in Newcastle just 3 or 4 years ago, and they said, we found the wind-up stage. So when in a pantomime or something, somebody would suddenly appear, the genie would suddenly appear in the centre of the stage. Well, they wind them up on a riser from under the stage. So they came and said, we found the theatre. If your band stays away from this platform, if you're underneath the stage, we'll wind you up. And it was a hand winder, you see. And we got all the fog machine. They put 2 smoke machines onto the stage. So in the middle of the stage was all fog. They couldn't see. And then I suddenly started singing the song below the stage and then just came up through the fog and missed. Of course, the band couldn't play with laughing, they thought, because they didn't know where the voice was coming from. It was really hilarious. And so those sort of things have always appealed to me. And obviously just to the audience. I think in England, I was known, I used to scare a lot of people. They do tell me now when the shows, when they were young, they're sort of 14, they'd see me on TV and I used to sort of scare them a little bit. And but in Europe, when I went on to have success in Holland and Belgium and those countries, they saw the humour in it. They switched on immediately to the humour in it, which we'll talk about a little later on.
From your onstage persona, the mystique, build in the audience's anticipation, and your kind of theatrical inspiration, we move on to the next chapter and we go from one berry to another famous Berry. We go back to 1963 and your first breakthrough, which was the hit Chuck Berry's song, Memphis, Tennessee. What made you decide to cover a Chuck Berry song? And can you talk about the exposure your cover received? And can I ask you about your thoughts on Berry as a songwriter and your impressions of him as a person?
Okay, yeah, fine. Well, when I signed with Decca in early '63, we were really struggling to find where they would place me, because I didn't have the voice for being an Eric Burdon or Van Morrison. Even though my interest in music was blues and R&B, I've never really had that gutsy voice. It's just nature, and I'm not really suited to that. So there used to be a BBC radio program on Saturdays called Saturday Club. Really, really big show. All the bands played it. We all played it. Stones, Beatles, everybody played Saturday Club. And we were searching for material to record. And I think he was, forgotten the producer's name. He contacted my agent in Manchester and said he had such a good response from the public to our version of Memphis, Tennessee on the BBC. And it was as simple as that. We just followed, Danny Batesh, who was my agent, called and said we had Stuart, I think his name was, the producer. And we followed that. We just said, oh, well, if the people wanted that song, then we recorded it. So that's how we recorded Memphis, Tennessee. And the second part of the question was Chuck Berry.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on in our conversation that you were a huge rock and roll fan. I wanted to ask about your impressions of Chuck Berry as a songsmith. And obviously you met him when he came to the UK. What were your impressions of him as a personality? Because we've heard so many stories about him as a businessman and quite a difficult personality. What were your encounters like with him?
First of all, I mean, I did, and I still think now, he did write the fantastic rock and roll songs. I mean, if you listen to any Chuck Berry song, I never realized it at the time, but he never repeats. It's the story all the way through. Roll Over Beethoven, Johnny Be Good, they're all stories. He doesn't repeat lines apart from the obviously chorus. And they were fantastic stories. I mean, no one's ever bettered Chuck Berry for his writing. In fact, was it someone said Alan Freed said or something? No, John Lennon said it, didn't he? If they should have, second name for rock and roll should have been Chuck Berry or something like that. It's fantastic, yeah. So that was great, and I did go and see him when they re-released Chuck Berry's version of Memphis. I mean, it was his song, so. But I was fortunate because I was living here in the UK, so I did all the publicity, the TV shows around the country. So that was very, very good. And I did see him on many occasions. Always disappointed with his live show because he never rehearsed the bands.
And the guitar's never in tune either.
No, someone's leave a guitar somewhere, said it didn't matter, just get another one. Most guitarists treasure their guitars, don't they? And it's pretty special. So, he was very difficult person. I did meet him when they re-released his version of Memphis, Tennessee. I was there at the launch when he came over, and Chuck's obviously version, he wrote it, fantastic. His went up the charts to about number 8, and mine stayed at about 17 or 18, which was fine because I was doing the promotion. So the song was a hit, and I was fortunate with that. And then I think just after that, about a year afterwards, he came over for a tour, and we contacted the promoter, and we went over to see Chuck in Manchester, booked in the Midland Hotel with him, so Keith, my driver at that time, we drove him over to Liverpool, drove him back to the Midland Hotel, and he did the gig in Manchester. You and I have had longer conversations in the last quarter of an hour than we had in 2 days. he just did not communicate. Bizarre, because I mean, most musicians, my long career, most musicians, apart from one or two, are fine. Everybody's, where you been working, did you play such a gig, how was it? Just general chatter. And it's great, but he was just impossible to. I remember going to see him at the Sheffield Fiesta, and he was there for a week. And I went in the afternoon, and I'm sort of backstage, and there's a young Irish band, you see, and they were chatting to me, and I said, "Well, what's happening?" He said, "We've no idea. We're backing him, but the only thing on the contract said that they got to have listened to a Chuck Berry LP. And that was it. And the only cues they had, if you watch him now, you'll see he'll lift his leg up and bring it down, and that means stop. And then if he'd lifted his arm up, that means start again. It was just bizarre. And that was it. They were on stage, and he walked on and introduced himself to them, and they shook his hand, and then 3 hours later they went on stage to back in no rehearsal. So it's quite quite bizarre, really. But that shouldn't take anything away from him. I mean, we're all different. So, but I mean, fantastic performer, and songs, not performer, but songs he wrote. But why didn't he just have a regular band? I can't believe it. Apart from Johnny Johnson, was it Johnny Johnson?
Johnny Johnson, he was an incredible piano player, yeah. And I've heard
An
many.
interesting thing was it Keith Richards said something about that, saying that, have you noticed that the songs that Chuck Berry wrote are in piano keys? That's right, isn't it? I think there's some. I'm not a musician, but there's something. His keys were not guitar keys, really.
You are right. Yeah, they were all in piano keys and some unusual keys as well. And we'll move from Chuck Berry. I've heard some fascinating, tremendous stories, and he still remains, despite the enigma, one of my heroes. And I did fortunately get to see him when I was only 11 years of age. We move from Chuck's influence now to, we have to say, probably your most famous hit, which is The Crying Game, released back in 1964. How did you come across the song? And is it a personal favorite of yours? And what were your thoughts on the track being used in the Neil Jordan film of the same name and Boy George's cover version of the song?
Yeah, well, the tape, the original tape was brought to me, or acetate as they used to call them then, on vinyl, was brought to me. Jeff Stevens, who wrote it, thought it would suit my voice, and so I had the song. And to be absolutely honest, I didn't really want to record it because it was a ballad, and I still wanted at that time to. I'd just toured with the Rolling Stones a couple of times, doing the R&B stuff, blues material. So I wanted to be like Chris Farlow or the Rolling Stones, roots in music. We tried it with Decca, so Memphis was successful. Then we had another Arthur Big Boy track called My Baby Left Me. Then we'd done a Shirelles number called Baby It's You. They were all sort of rootsy type material. So I didn't really want to record it, so I had it for months and months and months before. And then I was working in the studios with Big Jim Sullivan, as we mentioned earlier on, John Paul Jones, Jimmy Page, who were great musicians, young musicians, which was very important. They were session musicians, but they were still playing in bands at night. We'd go down Klutz Klieg after the sessions at Decca, which was literally next door in West Hampstead in London, and we'd watch the bands. Jimmy Page would be on with the band, and so they're really good young players. And they, again, when they were leaving sessions with me, they were going on to work with a whole mixture of musicians. I mean, people don't realize that they work with Herman's Hermits, many artists, middle of the road artists, and they would say to me, "It's a good song. Crying Game is a good song." And so I think it's the fact that they was, even though they were younger than I was, they seemed to have more general experience of the whole music business, because they were playing in young bands, and yet they were playing in the studios, working with a whole range of musicians. And I can't remember who said it to me, but somebody actually said to me in the studios that try and remember that a good song, whether it's a folk song, a blues song, a jazz song, gospel song, if it's a good song, it's a good song. And I think those words stuck with me, and I realized that they were right, really. So I did record it. But even then, I still wanted the B-side to be the A-side, which was Don't Give Me No Lip, which was more of a stomping song that I wanted to be recording. So that's how that all came about.
The song was a huge hit for you, and probably your most famous song you've recorded. But I kind of wanted to wind the clock on forward, and 30 years on, the song was used in the acclaimed Neil Jordan film of the same name, The Crying Game, which was a tremendous film and critically acclaimed at the time, and it received numerous Academy Award nominations and BAFTA awards as well. What was your take when you saw the film for the first time, your song being used in it, and also Boy George's cover version, which was also a hit record?
Well, first of all, I thought it was a tremendous film. I still do now when it's reshown. I always watch it. It's a really, really, really good film. And I was really proud of the fact that I've always had an interest, even today, in new music and new artists. You know, I'll go and pay my pound for the back room of a pub and watch a young band even now. So the bands in the 80s, I love them, you know, Pet Shop Boys, Boy George. And so I was really proud when the Pet Shop Boys were the session crew for Boy George's version of The Crying Game. That was Pet Shop Boys. So two of my favourite artists of that era were involved in recording The Crying Game. So I was very, 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 very proud of that. Because I'm a working musician, and I'm proud of my career, and I'm proud of, you know, other artists name checking me on things like that. And I'm 100% in the music business. So I was very proud of that. And also the fact that there must be about 20 different artists have recorded The Crying Game. One of my favourite versions was Billy Mackenzie from the Associates recorded it. There was a live version on YouTube from Ronnie Scott's club. So that was a terrific version. But possibly my all-time favourite was Kylie Minogue. On YouTube, there used to be a version of her singing it live as it was called in Manchester about 8-10 years ago. The NYMEX was called then. Don't think it's still on YouTube now, but she did a tremendous version of it. And it was the images that we talked about a little earlier on, that she'd obviously was still using that mystique of coming up through the mist at the top of the stage. I thought that was a great version. So I was very proud of all the versions.
We've spoken about one famous American songwriter that we both respect. Now let's come on to these shores and talk about another, Ray Davies, on this occasion. And you did a cover of a Kink song, which was a number one hit record in Holland and Belgium. What do you think? Why do you think the song was a hit in Europe? And can you talk about your experiences of performing in Europe and your fan base there, and why you decided to cover The Strange Effect?
Well, again, I'd worked with the Kinks. I mean, during that middle part of the 60s, it was quite normal to be on a show with Small Faces, Kinks, Engelbert Humperdinck could be on the same show. It'd be a whole mixture. They were really a continuation of variety shows, really, in the mid-60s. They had a compare. I mean, there was all those tours that people think were all rock and roll. They were not. They had a link man. There was a compare on. You know, we used to get booed off every night because the kids just wanted to hear the bands. So I'd worked with all these guys, and Ray and I have similar voices. You know, we don't have the best voices, and we tend to slide up to notes. You know, just edge around them and things. So he wrote the song. I mean, they never, well, I think there was a BBC radio version of it. It wasn't of This Strange Effect. It was never released as a single. And it just came through from Ray. I don't know the actual passage of how it got to me, but Ray had written it with me in mind. And so I recorded it, and just at that time, it was my current single. So when I was invited to go to the Knock Song Festival in Belgium, I mean, it was the Decca team. There was Joy Marshall, who was a sort of a girlfriend of Tubby Hayes, the jazz musician, a whole mixture of different artists. So we went as a team and competed against French, Belgians and Dutch. The team, we didn't win anything, but I had to make a decision before I went. Was I going to just throw it away and just go on and sing the song and think I've had a great weekend? And which was not really my style. I don't think I would have done that anyway. But I thought, no, if I'm doing it, I might as well just do my Dave Berry show. So I did the whole bit, and fortunately, there were a great camera crew there. So as anybody who's worked in theatre and television knows that usually the studio floors there's all sorts of stuff hanging around there. And so in the solo of This Strange Effect, I saw this it was the days of smoking, saw this like cigarette end on the floor of this live TV. So I bent over on one leg and picked up this cigarette end, and the camera zoomed in. It was very quick. It zoomed into my hand, and fortunately, it stood up. This cigarette end actually just stood up like that on the stage floor. And I think in that instance, something happened with theatre and rock and roll. And this, many artists will tell you that they knew that they'd broken through when something happened. They got a call to say, "Can you do?" Was it Ed Sheeran on Jules Holland a few nights ago? He said somebody was taken ill, so he got a call when he was in New York or something. "Would you do the Jules Holland show?" And that made him. He said that was absolutely fantastic. That just that one thing. And so that was me with that thing. But they saw the humour in it, you see. They didn't take me too seriously. They thought, they saw a bit of Stan Laurel there and things like that from Laurel and Hardy. And so that's it. We broke through with that. And then I went on to, I think, well, I did not say, I think I did. I had that within that summer, I think I had five records in the Dutch and Belgian charts, which was fantastic, and I did the Grand Gala de Disc in Amsterdam. That, I think a little later on we'll talk about that, because it was one of those defining moments, when I thought, this is fantastic. I was on with the Everly Brothers, Dinah Ross and the Supremes, Cilla Black, people like that, international names. And I was on this show with them. And rock and roll is a weird thing. You 2 years before or 3 years before, I was playing at the Picador Club in Blackpool, and then I'm on stage in Amsterdam with all these international names and having great success.
We'll shortly come on to some of those iconic tours in the 1960s. But before we do so, we've already spoken about some of the high caliber musicians that you've worked with and how young they were at the time. You've worked with session and backing musicians such as Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, Big Jim Sullivan, and Bobby Graham. Can you talk about your experiences with these musicians? And can you also tell me what you learned from them musically?
You have to remember that in the early days, we didn't really know what we were doing, I don't think. I don't think nobody had, as we said before, nobody had a grand plan. So we'd go into the studios. I do remember that Mike Smith, my producer, would we'll say we're booking a session at Decca, but we're going to wait for sort of 6 weeks. We're going to wait until the crew we wanted were available, Jimmy Page, John Paul, that session crew we wanted. But in the studios, it was quite bizarre because the parts were written out for them, but they had the freedom to try things out. I mean, on my first album, it's quite bizarre. I mean, the music business is bizarre. I mean, I was at this event a few years ago, and Jimmy Page was asking me which tracks he played on the album, you see. And so, well, if you listen to a track I did called CC Rider, that's Jimmy Page on harmonica. And then on Don't Give Me No Lip, that's Jimmy Page on harmonica in the solo in there as well. And also his girlfriend at the time was Jackie DeShannon, who wrote Needles and Pins for the Searchers. And she came to the studio with him, and they wrote a song together, which is on my first album. So nobody realized that Jimmy Page was writing stuff as far back as 1964, 65. But the general things in the studios, it was a matter of we used to go in sort of afternoon, probably say 1 till 3, and put 3 tracks down. So you put the backing tracks down. And once we were all happy with them, but we were all working, but they were actually adding things. Someone would say, why don't you try that in the studio? I mean, we did a track called LSP, which is a Lead Belly song. And Big Jim Sullivan was playing the guitar solo, but he was scat singing to himself. But you could hear it on the mic when he was running through. So we actually said, Jim, why don't we mic you up? And so if you listen to that Ella Speed, the Lead Belly song on the first album I did, you'll hear Jim Sullivan scat singing with himself when he plays the guitar. So there was a lot of freedom, even though most of the session crew were all sort of hands at it, half the Ted Heath band and things like that. Ronnie Verrill on drums, Johnny Hawkfoot on bass, Don Lusher on trombone. In fact, my dad was really proud because when I used to go home after my sessions at Decca, because I'd seen with my dad in the 50s at the Ted Heath band, they were his heroes and they were my heroes when I was growing up. I'd go home and say to my dad, you'll never guess who was on my session today. And I'd name, Ronnie Verrill on drums, Johnny, and he said, so that was it, yeah. It's the tradition of music, which, as I said before, is still with me today. I love everything around it and still do now. I love the hanging around in awful dressing rooms sometimes, and the contrasts is wonderful. Royal Albert Hall one night, or the Symphony Hall in Birmingham, then the next night you're playing in some venue in Taunton in Devon or Carlisle in Cumbria with like 300 or 400 people in. So it's what I consider to be a true musician is to play all venues.
Freedom of creativity, living in the moment, and experimentations in the recording studio with fine musicians that would go on to become household names. Talking about household names, let's go on to some of these famous tours throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. You toured with so many well-known acts, from the Everly Brothers, the Supremes, Cilla Black, James Brown, the Animals, and the Small Faces. What are your memories from those shows, and are there any particular highlights for you?
Yeah, again, it's, as I said before, it's because we were all so young and just starting out, there was no sort of hierarchy. We'd just be on with these bands. I remember the famous one we were doing the Olympia in Paris, and we'd gone over a couple of days before, and we were on with the Animals, Eric Burdon, the Animals. See, but the night before at the Olympia was James Brown and the Famous Flames on. See, so we just went to see them, and just sat there, went to a bar before the show, had a drink. No big deal. It was because no one knew at the time that if it was going to have any longevity at all. We always used to think about if we get 3 or 4 good years from it. This is not just me speaking. I mean, everybody would have said the same if you would have asked Beatles, Stones, Kink. You'd just think, or someone said to George Harrison about the art of the Beatles, he said, it's not art, it's just a laugh. Which I think was a great line, yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
Read into something that's not there, yes.
Good way of looking at things, really, isn't it? Just enjoy the moment. And
well, it was, yeah. I mean, that's what it is. And so, yeah, you'd just be with these artists. But as I said, there was no hierarchy. There was a headline act, obviously, but we were all mixing together and, you know, going after the gigs, staying at the same hotels, having a drink, falling around, laughing as, you know, as musicians do, relating stories about venues and things that happened on the road. So there was, just a very friendly atmosphere, and still has continued. You know, the artists that I met and worked with in the early days, I still have, you know, they're still my colleagues to this day. And because we grew up and came through a very important time in the British music history. And so I think there's sort of a camaraderie between us all, that we know we were there, even though at the time I don't think we realised how special it was. I think that's the unusual thing, is people ask me, you know, what it was like, and I say, well, as I've just explained to you, we just did our jobs and we were playing and having a laugh and a few drinks and making jokes and falling around just generally, like proper bands do, you know.
Dave, we'll stick on the theme of touring and life on the road. What are your memories of your time performing as a guest with Adam Ant and also the Sex Pistols? How did those opportunities happen? Can you talk about the relationship with those people, and the audience reaction of you being on the same bill as them?
Well, I think the first time I realised that we had a bit of an influence with the punk bands was at, I can't remember where I was, but I was doing a gig somewhere in London, only a rock venue, and I think my roadie came in and said, oh, there's some odd looking people want to come in the dressing room, you see. So I just said, yeah, okay, yeah. So these 2 or 3 guys came in, and 2 or 3 girls, you know, with, you know, pins through the noses and, you know, all the punk stuff. And of course, my first question was to them, was 10 years on from the 60s, don't forget. So I was never in the full flush of success in the mid-70s. I was working as I always wanted to work as a musician. And they're the ones who said, well, you know, we stood in the Banshees are doing some of your stuff, and you know, the Pistols, and Glenn Matlock had done The Strange Effect just afterwards, I think. So they were actually sort of, I think they were attracted to my presentation, really. It wasn't normal presentation, you know, man stands at the front of the stage, sings a song, and, you know, says thank you very much and good evening, nice to see you all, and stuff like that. You know, they saw something a bit unusual in my act. That's what attracted them. And I can't remember how they contacted me from Adam Ant. I can't really remember that now. And I was just invited to do, he wanted me to do 2 shows at the Empire, Leicester Square, I think it was. Whatever it was called, Empire and Leicester Square. And I did my set. I did No Lip and some of the different tracks at all. But it went down great, because I think what they did, they knew that if they were punks, so they knew if Adam Ant had invited me onto the show, that's what you have to remember, that they accepted that. If Adam Ant's okay with Dave Berry to come on stage and to support, then he must be okay. they probably weren't, most of them weren't probably aware of me at all. So that's how that came about. And he was very, very good. And I've seen Glenn Matlock a few times since. I know he lives over in America at the moment, so I've not seen him. But they're all sort of come to the shows, and it's good.
60 years in the music business and still performing, but you must have seen so many changes to the music industry and touring. And I wanted to ask you, do you still record and release new music? And if so, what platforms or media do you use? And what changes have you noticed throughout the years? Which ones have you embraced as an artist? And which ones are you maybe not so keen on?
A lot of questions there for me to get them in order. Where do we start? Just recap on that. Just recap the first. Give me a little section each time.
Yeah, so you've obviously in a 60-year career, you've obviously seen so many changes. Firstly, do you release new music? And if so, which platforms and media do you use?
Well, each era I've usually had something out. In the 80s, I had an album out, which I recorded with a guy called Alan Clayson, who was quite well known on the sort of bizarre music scene, Alan Clayson and the Argonauts. So he produced an album when I recorded a lot of his stuff called Hostage to the Beat. And then that 2 years ago, I then went back to my roots and did one called Memphis in the Meantime, which was my dedication to my favorite American roots artists, J.J. Cale, people like that, Tony Joe White. So that was another album I had out. And then I've tended to avoid recording just for the sake of it, because I think that cheapens an artist. I've had many offers to re-record some of my 60s tracks, but I turned them down because I think if you want to listen to, in my case, The Crying Game, then if you listen to The Crying Game, it's the original. There's not tracks that I recorded in 1978 and another one in 1992. So I've tried to keep myself separate from just recording for the sake of it. But I just have had a track out, a couple, father and son, actually, Dave McGurty from Cumbria. They were interested in, he'd written a track for me in the 60s, which unfortunately Decca didn't release. And so we did 2 more tracks with them, which have been quite successful. One was called Yesterday's Sunshine, and they were available just on the normal platforms, as far as I know. They did them very, very well. I've done a lot of the radio stations with those. But what we decided to do with that is people say that it sounds very 60s, and it intended to be. I'd always loved Phil Spector sound, with the 2 drummers and doubling up and everything. So we decided to just do something which was, Dave Berry singing in the 2021, but the sound of the 60s. So that's what I've done. So 2 sections. Yeah, I've not recorded, never re-recorded really my original tracks, but I've continued to record stuff every few years.
And recording has changed so much since the heyday of the 1960s, where it was analog. There was the kind of live feel to the recording, having to put that down in the moment, and the difficulty of doing that. It was almost like a live performance. Whereas now with digital, it's cost effective, it's cheap, anyone can do it, it's so fast. Do you have a preference? And for you as an older artist, could you adapt easily to the new digital techniques?
Well, I do, yes. I mean, because most of these digital techniques were all developed by musicians, weren't they? Really, generally, the technology in the studios is created by musicians, and it just makes the job easier. I don't necessarily always agree with it, the fact that you can, instead of, as we used to do, you'd get the tapes through and you'd run through and find the key. You can just go in now and they'll just say, oh, don't worry about that. Just we'll drop the key on the desk. You know, you can just sing it and then we'll take it up or take it down. And all that. I'm not really comfortable with that. But I don't think that live performance, apart from only 100% better. I mean, the sound systems now, I mean, it's first class. But in the early days, I mean, people don't believe it unless they hear it from the artist. But on those early shows with, as we talked about, you know, the Rolling Stones tours, you'd be using the theatre, you know, 20, 10-inch speakers all around the auditorium, because in the cinemas and things like that. And that's what the bands were using. Or you'd have just 2 Vox or Selma column speakers at the front with about 150 watts coming out the front. So the sound in the places was, well, it didn't really matter because the audience was there to see the artist and just, they weren't really listening to the music, they just wanted to visually see the artist. But I don't think the grassroots level has changed all that much. I mean, as I mentioned before, I still go out and see bands playing now. And it is pretty much, the enthusiasm is still there. And but they can go home and record tracks that the Beatles didn't even have on Sgt. Pepper, that's beyond the computer. But that's the way it goes. So you just have to use what's there.
And interestingly, if we go back to touring, and again to the heyday of the 60s, and you've mentioned all these fantastic shows where you would be on the same bill as these incredible acts that could range from being rock and roll to pop to soul, Motown, or whatever, those package tours. How much has touring and promotion changed from those heydays to now? Has there been a complete change for you? Is it completely different? Yeah,
there's been a completely different, but again, only for the better. I mean, it's very hard to explain to people what it was like touring in the 60s. You have to remember that hotels in the 60s, in the early 60s, there was no Premier Inns, there was no Travel Lodges, there was no Holiday Inn Expresses, there was no Crown Plazas. They were sort of station hotels, and the only people who stayed in hotels were business people and reps. Seriously, you know, people didn't. I mean, seaside hotels were usually abysmal anyway, and still are, most of them. But so that's changed. I mean, now you're on the road. You forget these journeys. I mean, from where I lived in Sheffield, I mean, to get to Glasgow or Aberdeen or Inverness, I mean, you'd actually go. Anybody knows the layout of the country, you'd drive from here across the Snake through the centre of Manchester on the A6, all the way up to Preston, and then up the A6 to Carlisle. And there were journeys from hell, really. There was no eating places. You couldn't stop for coffee or everything. And Sunday was the worst day to be travelling because, especially Scotland, I mean, there was nothing open apart from the hotels would be open on Sunday. So you'd be travelling and leaving one town, and you had to make sure you went to the corner shop before 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, because then they closed. So there was nothing open. So there was no glory days of travel. And I don't think if you would have asked someone, say in Penrith in 1964, about the swinging 60s, I don't think they'd probably hadn't ever heard of it. A lot of it was London, really, Manchester and Liverpool. And the music was there, but I have to explain to my daughter, who's a huge 60s fan, but she thinks that it was like, you know, like it is today, but it was with the 60s music. And I say, no, the pubs close at 10:30. They close at 10 o'clock on a Sunday. They opened at 12 noon till 2 or 3 in the week. And you couldn't, you know, go out and eat, apart from when the Burney Inns, which were the Wetherspoons is probably the equivalent to the Burney Inns in the 60s. That was the only place. So it's 100% better now. touring, all the bands also, again, everybody just had one roadie. I mean, the Stones had Ian Stewart. Ian was the original piano player in the band, and Ian was the man. All the bands just had like one or two roadies, no security, no. You'd find your own way into the theatre, and then at night, fighting your way out of the bike. Anybody seen any of the films of the shows in the 60s will see the artists rushing out of the stage doors to try and get into the car, but there was nobody had security. And so, but it was still a wonderful time. I'm downplaying it, but you asked me how it's changed, and I think it's changed much. It's much better now, much better now.
If we come back to the current time now, we've obviously mentioned that you're still performing and you go on tour with some of the retro 60s groups. But I wanted to ask you about some of your favorite venues that you perform on a regular basis. And then second to that, can you describe your fan base and the audience that actually come and see you today?
The last question, I think, is probably what I'll answer first. I think that you have to be realistic in the music industry, and it will happen to the 80s bands and the 90s bands in 20 years' time. Most of our audience now are people in their 70s, really, because if you were 16 in 1964, what are you going to be? I'm not very good at maths. Can't be mid-70s. So they're like we are. They're with my age group, and the artists, we're all older. So obviously our audiences are older. And we do get a sprinkling of younger people in, usually the ones who came with their parents, 20 or 30 years ago, and they got hooked on, like the music, and they like the artists. So they still come, a few of them in their sort of 50s and early 60s. So that's just one of the things that happens in music, unfortunately. We can't, and there's nothing we can do to change it, really.
Do you ever get any young musicians or wannabe singers that come up to you and say that you've been an inspiration and that they're big fans of your music, and because of what you've laid down in the 60s that they want to replicate that? Yeah.
Honestly, that's one of the things that for me is wonderful. And in fact, the last tour I did last November, the monitor mix guy on stage was this young guy of about 19, and he was a huge, I could identify with it because I was exactly the same when I sort of sat in the dressing room with the Everly Brothers and people like that. And you think, is this really, am I really this real? I'm sat with these people that when I was 16 or 15, I'm thinking, the Everly Brothers, I mean, and but I got on really well with him. And in fact, he came over to my house and brought his recording equipment, and I put a voice on the track, a blues track they'd written. It's a young band, and so that's just about. I think they're bringing it out on vinyl soon. But that's what I like about it. So I can meet the older musicians, and I get on well with them. But it's the younger ones I do enjoy that part of it. Yes.
Dave, one last question, and then we move on to that time, which we do with all your Take guests. We ask them the quick fire questions just to finish up the interview and establish maybe things that we don't know about them. But before we do so, outside of music now and performing, what would you cite as your hobbies and areas of interest? And have you ever considered working in any other creative areas outside of music?
My interests have always been, I go cycling, and I go walking. I've walked Snowdon a couple of times, the Brecon Beacons, and when I've been touring, I like to get out and do things. When I was in Australia, I climbed the Sydney Harbour Bridge with the lighting technician on the tour. We were the only two who did it after about 27 years. I've got the photographs, right right on the top. Funny story with that, this young guy who's, because you're actually clipped on as you're walking, because it's really amazing. You clipped onto a running rail, you see. So I said to this young guy who was about 18, I said, if I fell off, would this hold me? He said, nah. Nah, won't hold you now. Quite funny that, yeah, just the typical Australian humour. Yeah, and you're, nah, it won't hold you now. And things like that. Did a tour on, finished up in Acapulco, stayed for a week there after the tour, and saw the divers from there. I know it's a tourist thing with them. And so I generally like to go out and visit places. And so I've always kept a separate side of the music where I can be out doing other things. And have I thought of another career? When I was younger, I used to get asked that question, and I used to think, well, I would probably go into management. But then I thought, no, management is a tough profession. I mean, you can't create artists. Artists create themselves. They can be guided. But the thing is, when someone said to me once, can you give any advice? I'd say, well, best advice I ever had was don't give advice. So it is difficult to know when you've been involved in it as long as I have and loved it all. I mean, I love before, I love the traveling. I love hotels, doing the gig. Sat in a lovely dressing room or an awful dressing room. Anybody on the road will know that. You can be 1 minute in a lovely suite somewhere, and the next minute you're in some dump. And but that's the nature of the business, and I actually still love all that. And I like to travel at night. A bit of maverick in me enjoys these bizarre things of driving on the outskirts of a city, and everything is in darkness. Everybody's in bed, tucked up in bed, and I'm driving past at 3:15 in the morning. Things like that.
I can imagine music management can be a dirty business, and we've heard so many stories recounted of artists that have been ripped off financially by agents, promoters, and people in the music business. That aside, one thing we haven't mentioned is your appearance in a theatrical play, which was called The Mod Crop back in 2009. Is that an area you'd like to maybe explore again? And also, you're now 81 years of age.
You have to keep mentioning.
Sorry. Is there a time where you want to pack it all in and just relax and go traveling and enjoying the retired life, or do you just want to keep? Is it just in the blood? You just want to carry on?
Yeah, we'll just keep on,
and entertaining.
Yeah. I would never, voluntarily retire. No, it's such a great profession. I've loved it 60 years, and I still love it. Yeah, and. Again, I've answered the final part of the question, and I've forgotten the middle part.
That's my mistake, because I asked too many questions. Yeah, it was you were in a theatrical production.
Mod cropping. Yes. Again, these things are all jumbled up. I don't know how they contacted me like you do, on the computer. So this production people contacted me, and it was a young production. They were all amateurs, and they wanted me to. This actress was going to sing a couple of verses of the Crying Game, or the first verse, and then my only appearance in this whole production was there was a gantry at the back of the stage, and in the when she started singing the Crying Game, I then appear in sort of a mist and just glide across for about 2 minutes. And that was what my appearance was in Mod Crop. Young production, that's what it was. That's what it was, yeah, about 2.5 minutes. And that was it. But I was in another production in the 60s in, was it Westcliff-on-Sea? They wanted me to do this production of Espresso Bongo, which Cliff Richard had done in in the film, I think it was in the 50s. But I was just taking the part of a pop singer, so it wasn't really acting. I was just taking this pop singer, really. So that was my only, things in acting profession. But I've still continued to be a member of Equity. I mean, I'm a long-serving member. Politically, I've always felt that there's a strength of the unions. If you stick together, you get things done. So I've always, for 1965, I joined Equity, and I've been a fully paid up member since then. And I believe that even now we could get things changed, because there are some one or two dodgy promoters, who expect the artists to do things that's not acceptable. And I've had this on a personal experience, that I've tried to talk to the other artists and say, look, if we just say we're not prepared to do that, and you get 5 of the singers from the band are on tour, we're not prepared to, sign 2 guitars every night where you sort of raffle them off and we don't get anything, or do a DVD of the show and the artists don't get anything from it. I said, but if we actually approach them professionally and say, look, it's not acceptable, but all together, and then they won't do it, because they're jeopardizing. The problem is they're jeopardizing 50 nights work in the theatres in one run of tour date, so they don't want. And I said, well, that's exactly what they know. So I'm the one usually who'll say something, and I get the bad name, because they won't stick together. So I think that is a disappointing thing in the music business, that these things happen. Instead of sticking together, we sort of they accept it and nothing changes.
Dave Berry, we come on to that moment. This is the part of the interview we ask every single Your Take guest the same questions. The quick fire questions, you don't need to think about these in any great detail. You ready for these?
Okay.
Here we go. So, what would you say is your favorite pastime?
Walking.
We've spoken a lot about music, of course, obviously. We've spoken about creativity, the theatre, performance, but we haven't really touched upon film. What would you say is your favourite film and why?
All Quiet on the Western Front, because I think that the things about the First World War and the Second World War should be part of the curriculum in schools. I think younger people should be made aware of the things that are happening, which, as we know, which is happening now with Russia. So I think these films should be shown at schools, or at least give them some education. I'm sure that they are in quite a few, and I know that my granddaughter is aware of it. She's aware of the book, the original book, and then the new version of the film, which was shown just a few nights ago. Yeah,
a good choice and an incredible film. Probably one of the greatest war films ever put on celluloid, All Quiet on the Western Front. We move from cinema to novelists now. Who would you say is your favourite?
George Orwell. I know he's a writer from a long time ago, but what I like to do is books that I read in the 60s, I like to reread them. So I went recently and bought Road to Wigan Pier, and the one when he trekked across, down to Spain to support the Spanish Civil War, Keep the Aspidestra Flying. So I bought those 3 and reread them.
1984 was an incredible book, and in some ways an amazing forecast on the world today, not necessarily in this moment, but politically, and the powers of the state and people watching you. And a lot of his work still has stood the test of time and very relevant to what's happened. Yeah. We move from Orwell now to professions, and you did mention a different one, but If you could have chosen a different profession outside of the music business, what would it have been?
With hindsight, hotel management. I love hotels and got lots of friends who are managers of hotels, and it's similar to music. You know, they're called on duty halfway through the night to cover for someone who doesn't turn up. And a hotel management, but he was never aware of it when I was at school. I never knew anything about the hospitality profession.
I worked for a manager once in the cinema business who was a hotel manager, and he told me that it was a very, very tough job. He said,
it's tough. Yeah, tough job, but it's just that. Oh, but they're sort of meeting people all the time. They're very much like being a musician. They sort of with all different people every day.
Yeah. Or a journalist, I guess.
Yeah.
Covering
hotel
different
management
stories.
or journalist, because I've still got friends who are journalists, and I've always gotten well with journalists. So journalism and hotel management.
Dave, who in life would you say has been your greatest inspiration?
The one who stayed with me from the beginning to now, Bob Dylan. I think the way he's changed his career right the way through from when I first saw him. I was there in 1965, 66 at the Gouldman cinema in Sheffield when he did his infamous electric set, second half. And so right the way through to, I saw him a couple of years ago with Van Morrison at the Arena when he was wonderful, because he was just like walking into a bar, with a bar band. They just played they didn't play as though they were in an arena, they just played. And then the album, from the 12-inch single, was it Murder Most Foul, which was unbelievable. Who would have thought that somebody would record that about the assassination of Kennedy? I thought that was fantastic, yeah. And then
you know Van Morrison, of course, and you've toured with him, but have you ever met Dylan?
Never, no. But that's not unusual for me, because I think it was Nick Ronson, some new guitar player came into the band when Nick Ronson was with him and said, "Excuse me, but what's Bob Dylan like?" He said, "I don't know, he's never spoken to me. I've been with him 7 months."
Tremendous.
I thought that was a great story, that, yeah. He asked the guy, yeah. That's it.
From Bob Dylan now, his wise words and his tremendous lyrics to newspapers. Do you read a newspaper? And if so, what is your choice of newspaper?
I read the Times and the Sunday Times. Every day I get the Times, and I spend the morning, my wife and myself, we sit in the dining room and we'll have a quiet hour and a quarter, we're having coffee, and we read the wonderful Times, yeah. And that's it, yeah.
Cuisine next. Are you a cook, but what would you choose as your favourite food?
I'm not a cook at all. I think my favourite food is French cuisine, really. I've travelled through France many times and had some wonderful, wonderful food. You just stopping off. I once drove to the south of France, and there was a book out at the time called Alternative Route to the South of France by a guy called Epiron. And he actually told you the journey to make. It took about a week, and where to stay, a little small hotel restaurant where the patron was the, cook and everything. And they were wonderful journeys. Stopping to eat the wonderful French. And also with wine, I know that there's some wonderful wines from California and Chile and Argentina, but the French were the ones who virtually invented it, weren't they? But for French wine and French food, yeah.
They were indeed. We go from French cuisine to favourite cultural icons. Who would you cite as yours? When we say cultural icon, it could be a religious leader, could be somebody who's changed the world or transformed it in a positive way, somebody in the world of politics, a statesman, could even be Bob Dylan again, but who would you choose?
Just off the top of my head, because obviously these things change. I mean, I could think Dennis Skinner, the Labour politician.
Of course, yeah.
I think that the way he was not disrespectful, but he would stand up in the House of Commons, and obviously he must have been asked to leave the House of Commons by the Speaker more than anybody else in history, I would think. And he quite openly says things, and he knows that the Speakers are going to say you have to leave the House, and he'd walk out. That's it. Maybe stick his two fingers up at them as he walked.
Several things come into my mind when I think of Dennis Skinner. Firstly was the quote that he had to apologise, calling David Cameron Dodgy Dave, and also the thing he did with Black Rod, when that tradition of Black Rod coming into the Houses of Parliament, and he would always make some tremendous quirk, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he was called the Beast of
Bolsover.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, Bolsover, where I live in Derbyshire, it's only 10 miles away. It's a village of Bolsover, yeah, an old mining village. Yeah.
I'm liking that choice. And I had a lot of respect for Dennis Skinner, very much like I do for Tony Benn.
Yeah.
Two very different people, but obviously cut from the same cloth, same political party. For Dennis Skinner now, and I imagine he's used a lot of these curse words, what would you choose as your favourite curse word and why?
Very good, yeah. I think to call someone a twat is even worse than using the C word or F word. It's so degrading, I think. If you say that someone, he's a real twat. That's my favourite swear. It's not really a swear word, is it really? I don't think it's...
I don't know. I don't think it is. I think you're right.
I don't think it would be... I think you could use it in normal conversation. You could sort of say, we should stop twatting about, something like that. But yeah, twat is a good...
You've travelled many places in the world, particularly through music and performance, and we spoke about some of your favourite places and French food. But what is your favourite place or holiday destination?
First, Madeira. I first went to Madeira way back in 1966, I think it was, when you had to fly into Portugal first and then fly out, because the landing strip in Madeira is still now one of the most scary landings that there is in the world. And I always liked Madeira. Yes, I used to, the lavernas they're called, the irrigation systems that come down the mountainsides to irrigate the crops and foods, corn and whatever they grow in Madeira. And I've had some very, very happy times in Madeira. So that's my favourite holiday place. If someone said, you can go to a place tomorrow, that's where I would go.
The question you never want to ask a musician, because they have so many influences, and you've spoken in this conversation about many of them, but who is your favourite music artist and what is your all-time favourite album?
I think my favourite artist would be, again, Bob Dylan, because I've always believed with an artist, there's nothing written in stone that you must play in your set, everything that people know from you. I think you should be adventurous. And as long as you think carefully about the set and you mix material, roots music, newer songs with your own, if in my case, my old 60s artists or any artists, your hits that people remember. And I've always found that Bob Dylan would do that, or he would recreate the songs that people know, so that you're halfway through the song and you realise he's singing Mr. Tambourine Man, and you didn't realise until you sang the words. So yes, I like that idea of putting new things into the set. And if 60% of the audience just not dismiss it, but just don't say anything about it, there might be 20-30% who will come up to me after and say, I loved it when you sang that song, because nobody else would have. To give you an example, in my set now, I do the Bob Dylan set that Adele did. I make you Make You Love Me. What's the I finish my set sometimes with that, just with the keyboards and synths, and it's just my voice and the keyboards.
And I mentioned albums. Do you have a favourite album, or do you have a favourite Dylan album?
Yes, the Dylan album, which he did of his take on all these standards. I've forgotten what the album is called now. CD, yeah, about 5-6 years ago. And when you first play it, it's really, you think this is ridiculous, because obviously Dylan's not really got the most melodic voice. So to hear him singing, not My Funny Valentine, but a standard song. But once you keep playing the CD, you really are attracted to it. So I think that, and I can't remember what the title of the CD is, but it's his take on all the standards from the 40s, 30s and 40s and 50s.
2 final questions, but I like what you said about Dylan, that he's an artist that has never taken the safe road and has done different things. And I think that's what makes an artist interesting, and not many do it. They kind of remain almost one-trick ponies. And Dylan was one of the few exceptions, and David Bowie kind of springs to mind, somebody who just kept creating and recreating and changing with the times, and just kind of ripping up the rule book. From Dylan again now to your greatest achievement to date, what would you say it is?
I think my success in Holland and Belgium, particularly, I think that changed everything for me, because it was very, very good for me, because from the point of view of that, as we know, most artists, probably not the case now, but most artists from my era had sort of 3-4 years of success. And then even through the 70s, then, Sweet and Slade and those people you sort of have, and then disappeared, and then you're just trudging around the country from then on. The fact of my success in Holland and Belgium put me in good stead to get a nice advance from Decca Records to re-sign, because when my contract ran out, usually artists signed for 3 years. And then after 3 years, that's your chart success, or it was in the 60s. So I had the advantage then that I could negotiate to re-sign. I could have re-signed with Immediate Records with Andrew Lowe Golden, who was the manager of the Stones at the time. And he was my publicist. So I knew Andrew quite well in the band. And he wanted me to sign for Immediate, along with P.P. Arnold and Small Faces. But I've always been loyal to people, and I felt that Decca had been good to me. I was a very difficult artist for them to place. I don't think they quite knew I was neither a pop singer, or I wanted to be a blues and R&B singer, but I hadn't got the voice. So I can imagine the confusion is, where do we place this guy? If you listen to my early albums and things, I've got a mixture of, God Bless the Child by Billie Holiday, and Just a Little Bit by Roscoe Gordon, and, My Baby Left Me, and then there'd be Ellis Speed by Leadbelly. It was all this mixture of material. So they persevered and tried their best with me. And I was with them with Decca for 10 years. And I recorded 100 sides with Decca.
Wow, incredible.
On a double, they brought them all out on a double CD, all 100 tracks from 1963 to 1972, I think it was. So I re-signed with them, and so financially I had a nice start in the mid-60s, whereas many of the other artists got sort of not cast on the scrap heap, but they didn't have any, they just earned their money from touring, which we didn't really earn a lot from touring in the early days. Not like the bands today when you break through.
Dave Berry, the final question: how do you wish to be remembered?
I wish to be remembered as a One thing I can, in plain language, as being a proper musician, I've always respected Robert Plant, people like that. You know, Robert was in the biggest band in the world, and yet here you can see him at the Winding Wheel, which is a small venue here in Chesterfield in Derbyshire. He's a real musician, and he'll play with he's got different bands from his years with Zeppelin, different bands, and he's playing in different venues, smaller venues. And so he's a true musician, and I think he's probably one of my musical heroes for that fact, that he's continued to tour and not to keep the image of Led Zeppelin as his mainstay.
And like yourself, he knows his roots, and he's never kind of veered away from those roots, has he? Which has been blues, R&B,
Yeah, such a nice guy.
Rock and roll, country. Yeah.
I mean, these guys, I remember that the arena in Birmingham, and when we were doing a big sort of show with Tony Iommi and Rick Wakeman, it was a yearly thing that Jasper Carrot put on for charity every year. And they invited all different artists that they liked themselves. Lenny Henry was promoting it with Jasper Carrot. So you're thrown in all with this great mix of artists, you know, UB40 and then Lulu and Tony Iommi and with Rick Wakeman. And he came up to me and said, we supported you in 1964 at Stourbridge Town Hall. They would support one of his first bands. But real musicians remember those things, you know. We all remember our roots. And we remember when we first started how we played at different shows. Chris Spedding wrote something in my book that you mentioned, that when they were just starting out as a young band, before he moved to London in the late 50s, early 60s, that they played this venue with us, and how they'd always remembered being on the show with Dave Berry and the Cruisers. So you've got this continuity all the time with real musicians, and I would like to really be remembered as just a real musician, even though I don't play an instrument.
But then, in fairness, Dave, you could have turned back to Robert Plant and said, but I played with Jimmy Page long before he was with you.
And that's true. I could have done, actually, yeah. But I didn't know the relationship they have together, you see, so I have to be careful. You don't know with bands, do you, what the relationships were. Now, they went out as Plant and Page, so they must have been okay together. I'm sure they were.
The end chapter of this interview this evening, but of course not the end chapter in your musical career as you carry on touring and performing to this day and in your life. But thank you for the story. It's just been a fascinating, almost history lesson of, you know, tracing back even before the 1960s with roots music, how rock and roll really gave you a thrill and a kick up the backside, I guess, because you knew straight away that's what you wanted to do. And we've mentioned all the greats from Elvis to Cochrane to Charles Edward Anderson Berry, whoever he might be, some of the great blues musicians and all the incredible stories and people you've performed with. And in fairness, the word legends is kind of overused these days. They call anyone a legend, but the people you've mentioned in this interview, other names as well, we could be here all night, the Everly Brothers, seeing them and being on tour with them, they are simply legends of music. It's incredible what they've laid down and what was laid down in the 60s. So thank you for the music you laid down yourself and all your colleagues, because it's timeless. I wasn't even born in this era, and I pretty much, that's all I ever listened to. I love putting on Gold and listening to, they're just great, great records.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity of going through my career. It's been a pleasure.
And where do we see you next on the road? How do we find out more? Your website?
Yeah, my website is usually, I'm not, so I think someone does a Facebook page, but I don't use Facebook myself. But I usually just say to people, if you need to know anything, just go on my website. Just put in Dave Berry's website, Dave Berry at cryinggame.co.uk.
Thank you for sharing all the stories. and for being such a gentleman.
Thank you very much.